Yes, it's my pleasure to invite you to welcome you all tonight to our first autumn meeting, our first speaker event. I hope you're all enjoying yourselves, and I'm certain you're going to enjoy tonight's lecture from tonight's guest, Muireann O'Cinneide. Muireann is joining us from Galway today, where she's a lecturer at the University of Galway in English literature. She's published a monograph, Aristocratic Women and the Literary Nation, 1832 to 1868, that was published by Palgrave Macmillan. And she's also edited 2 volumes in the Pickering and Chatto Selected Works of Margaret Oliphant. She's also co-edited Women Writing War, Ireland, 1880 to 1922. And likewise, she co-edited another volume of essays, Language, Literacy and Reading in 19th Century Ireland. Muireann's current research is on travel writing, mobility, and conflict narratives. But tonight she's going to present to us on Kipling and engineering. Specifically, there's more than engines to a ship, steamships and accelerated unities in Kipling's The Day's Work of 1898. Well, without further ado, over to you, Muireann.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and thank you to the whole Kipling Society. It's, of course, always considered good form anyway to thank the group that have invited you. I feel, though, I should issue particularly devout thanks to the Kipling Society because ever since I started working on Kipling's steamship fiction, obviously steamship writings, as many of you, most of you will probably know, many of the stories I'm discussing involve incredibly elaborate technical details, which usually leave me completely bewildered and sort of in a cold sweat in my hotel room the night before a conference. And each time I take a deep breath and I turn to the Kipling Society webpage and weep tears of relief as I remind myself what a garboard strake is. So devout thanks to all the scholarship and expertise that this society represents. I'm going to now hopefully again resume or start screen sharing and I would hope that you are now all looking at an introductory slide. Are you, may I ask?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. And just to aside, usual Zoom provisions. Can everyone hear me okay?
Certainly, yes, thank you.
Excellent. Then let us proceed. And after all these years of Zooming, you'd think basic stuff like that's more like it. Slide moving would proceed. Right. So my paper today is using the writing of Kipling to explore the discourses surrounding the transnational infrastructure of the 19th century steamship and its Atlantic crossings. Serving as vital agents of later Victorian capitalist globalization, steamships became the instruments of profoundly new understandings of culture, time, and space. So what I want to do today is examine a selection, 3 short stories in Kipling's 1898 volume, The Day's Work, in which he traces a tension between conceptions of the steamship as a single dependent node in a dramatically expanding socioeconomic globality, and also at the same time an entity through whose self-generated speed and motion, new understandings of accelerated modern selfhoods and communities could be forged. And I'm particularly interested, and I'll come back to setting this up shortly, in Kipling's exploration of the kind of relationship he creates between, if you like, good and bad forms of steam speed, and the relationship that he creates very much based on the idea of the relationship between the forms of speed the steamship is capable of and the requirements of the individual body and individual labor that is in order to produce those different types of speed. So I'm going to begin. I won't give you an entire sweeping history of the steamship. I'm wildly unqualified to do so anyway, but I just want to spend a couple of minutes at the beginning reminding us, I suppose, of establishing some overview context, just sort of think about and encourage us to think a bit further about what the steamship represented in that later part of the 19th century. So by the late 19th century, of course, transatlantic networks of connections had expanded and developed the cultural and economic connections between Britain and its thriving former colony, the United States, whose own, of course, internal maritime communities had been profoundly reshaped by encounters with steam. So the point is that when you think about transnational connections, these discourses weren't just a matter of improved speed. It isn't just, oh, Britain and America can get to each other, British and American people can get to each other faster. It's rather the steamship as a concept became integral to the construction of North America and Britain, facilitating a kind of imaginative space of a type of renewed union, so both the tool of such a union and the symbol of it. But such networks created by these, are not so much unifying as dividing in terms of access to the benefits of power and motion. Of course, any discussions of later 19th century transatlantic crossings is necessarily haunted by other earlier, less voluntary journeys, emigrants crammed into steerage, and of course those bleak diagrams of slave ships on the Middle Passage, not to mention the mid-19th century steamships of the Mississippi slave trade. Moreover, the unprecedented new speeds that steam offered became swiftly conscripted to the cause of imperial expansion. So over the course then, from the early to the mid to late 19th century, we see then a series of developments in the world of steam and speed that allow for a very different understanding of what that ocean might mean and what types of speed might be possible. But this speed is not just seen then, my screen a bit here, excuse me. In relation again to England and America, but also to the wider possibilities from a very early stage that steam was increasingly being seen as a tool of empire. So as Neil Ferguson points out, initially the Admiralty's first reaction had been to see steam as a potential threat to, of course, Britain's traditional naval supremacy. But far from weakening the empire, Ferguson suggests, steam power tended to knit it together. So even as early as 1837, we see the Governor General of India, welcoming steam as a kind of accelerant of a type of imperial unity. The great want of this Eastern world, India, China, etc., may be comprehended in the single word knowledge. On this great space where the human mind has been buried for ages in universal darkness, I look to steam navigation as the great engine of working this moral improvement. In proportion as the communication between the two countries shall be facilitated and shortened, so will civilized Europe be approximated, as it were, to these benighted regions. So even then, as early as the 1830s, speed here and steam here is being figured as a kind of epistemological accelerator that in turn becomes a type of civilizational accelerator. The centuries of European darkness, to use Bentinck's terms, can be transcended, allowing a new colonial modernity to emerge. So after centuries then in which human intercontinental travel had been essentially tied to the natural world, steamships and their engines seem to offer a new form of freedom. And obviously, of course, for centuries, you think about the sailing ship, obviously there's, remarkable developments in terms of structures and building. But there's still a fundamental sense that in terms of humans' ability to say, to travel, to go from continent to continent, humans for centuries were still fundamentally reliant, weren't they, more or less on wind. You could maybe overcome that with a whole pile of very immediate physical human labor and things like galleys. But the fact remains that the movement of waves, of the sea, of wind, all of which, of course, still affect steamships. But the power and the speed and the idea of a sort of self-generated speed coming from engines rather than the relationship of sails and ropes and oars with wind and wave. If you think about it, it allows for a very different understanding of the ship and of the position of the human in the ship. So just as the imperial trade they helped fuel produced accelerated class and economic changes in Victorian Britain, steamships themselves offered, I'm suggesting, fantasies, both of a kind of heroic autonomy and of a kind of accelerated social connections. But of course, this is ultimately a fantasy, because there's a paradox here. On the one hand, the idea of the steamship as kind of a solitary, independent, self-fueling thing. But on the other, they are themselves, of course, hyper-networked entities. They all require collective extractive labor, the fuel that must be mined and transported, the engines that must be maintained, and of course, the wider network of trade, cargo, passengers, and investment that'll make the maintenance and operation of the ship feasible. So the paradox here is brought into sharp relief by the steamship at the vessel at the centre of Charles Marlowe's journey in Conrad's Horse of Darkness. That even as Marlowe acknowledges the conquest of supposedly blank spaces by the operations of colonial capitalism, it's the steamship, ironically the trading vessel crucial to these operations, that seems to him to offer a channel into a form of heroic adventure. Dash it all, I thought, they can't trade without using some kind of craft on that lot of fresh water. Steamboats, why shouldn't I try to get charge of one? But of course, as As Marlowe discovers, Steamship does not just represent uncomplicated adventure, but rather also the potential, as his later frantic pleas for rivets. What I wanted for rivets, there were cases of them down the coast, cases piled up, burst, split. As his call suggests, steamships are subject to multiple internal vulnerabilities, both from their mechanical workings and from the economic and psychological machinations of those who sailed in, traded in, or owned them. And so now, finally, you may say, we turn, of course, to Kipling himself. And I don't need to tell any of you that Kipling is one of the, possibly, I think, the 19th century writer who's most sort of enthusiastically embracing the technological and artistic possibilities of an interconnected mechanical age. And we see, of course, in his famous dramatic monologue, MacAndrew's Hymn, 1894, which produces in its gloriously clanging couplets a celebration of the speed of steam engines, as a form of divine destiny. Romance those first-class passengers, they like it very well, printed and bound in little books, but why don't poets tell? I'm sick of all their quirks and turns, the loves and doves they dream. Lord, send a man like Robbie Burns to sing the song o' steam. And then in the one that I think one of the poem's most extraordinary passages, they're all away through beatful power, the clanging chorus goes, clear to the tunnel where they sit my purring dynamos, interdependence absolute, foreseen, ordained, decreed, to work you'll note at any tilt and every rate of speed. In this moment, then, the speed of the steam engines, but the speed that is not just a matter of the divine confer, the speed that has been generated by the loyal, assiduous labours of MacAndrew, is itself becoming a form of divine destiny, but one that is enacted by the faithful labour of MacAndrew. I will, by the way, have a brief caution at this point. We will be encountering a great many Scottish ships engineers in looking at the Kipling works on this in this paper. I will not, on the whole, be attempting the dialect as far as possible, so I'm afraid feel free to, fill in your own Scots approximations as you go. So Kipling sees then in the steamship, I'd argue, a means to imagining and securing a unified Anglo-American imperial world order. He is, of course, also infamously author of The White Man's Burden, with its subtitle To the United States and the Philippines. And that poem's infamous invitation to the United States to join Britain in a racialized configuration is notably marked in the poem's worldview by a creation of a set of imperial transport infrastructures through the sacrificial labor of white bodies. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread, go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. So the infrastructure that the steamship requires and the Anglo-American trans-imperial unity it promises enacts a certain type of labour that in its relentless rhythm, both the rhythm of the ship and implicitly the rhythm of the poems, breaks down the boundaries between white human bodies and transport infrastructures. And this breaking down of these boundaries is what I want to explore in Kipling's fiction today, because this breaking down that I argue produces new forms of accelerated unities, the good and bad forms of speed, as we'll discuss, whose effects are both triumphant and horrifying. Incidentally, another outcropping of this project includes some discussion of Captains Courageous and the presence or absence of steam in that ship-fascinated books, but we might talk about that afterwards. For today, of course, my focus is on Kipling's The Day's Work. So Kipling's today's work then would be looking at three stories, and I want to take us through in a rough order: Bread Upon the Waters, The Ship Have Found Herself, Around Little, and then The Devil and the Deep Sea. Now, the volume of the title itself, like the title of the volume, It's a Day's Work itself, as its religious overtones suggest, itself gestures towards the idea of labour as a form of spiritual action. In these three stories specifically, though, I'm going to argue that each story deploys the steamship, again, as simultaneously one node in a network of globalized colonial capitalism, but at the same time itself a distinct entity, a host for colliding economic and political machinations and colliding machine parts. Above all, I'm arguing the steamship in these stories functions as a sort of figuring through which to meditate on forms of acceleration, both literal and figurative, and on the societal, economic, and psychological costs to be paid for the attainment of speed. But even as I'm sort of talking about the steamship as a figure, that I think, just to think of the steamship as metaphor, in fact, underestimates, I think, the aesthetic ambition with which Kipling is writing about the steamship. It's not just that he wants to use the steamship as a metaphor. It seems to me that his fiction is seeking to bring the essence of the steamship into a type of narrative being, into, in essence, and we'll come back to this at the end, maybe create the work of the steamship through the work of reading. And so he then proceeds to explore, then, having tried to bring the essence of the steamship into narrative being, he wished to explore the ways in which the unnatural accelerations embodied by the steamship can be tested, fractured and broken, yet also remade in unexpected ways. And in these stories, then, I'm going to trace what I see as a kind of a developing movement, a developing breaking down to better and worse effect of the boundaries between human body, the body of the human body of the man and the body of the ship, so to speak. Um, and the first story I'm going to go into in some detail today is 1895, what's all 1895's Bread Upon the Waters, which I think most concisely sets out some of the key oppositions and tensions which Kipling uses the steamship to explore. So Bread Upon the Waters features, again, a gruff but honourable Scottish engineer, McPhee, and McPhee, you'll notice, bears on his body the marks of his years of service to his ships. So a 32-year knowledge of machinery and the humours of ships. One side of his face had been wrecked through the bursting of a water god. His nose rose grandly out of the wreck. He can guide your fingers through his hair to show how he had come by his trademarks. So Bread Upon the Waters, as you probably know, is told by a third person, the usual sort of Kipling-esque narrator figure, who discusses with McPhee and his wife Janet what has taken place. So much of the story comes then through the voice of McPhee. But in that moment and in that description, it's a largely therefore realist story. Whether it's realistic is perhaps another question. And therefore, but even in this opening description, we can see sort of Kipling's interest in the idea that his work on the ships has already kind of marked McPhee's body, that, the very fact that his nose rode grandly out of the wreck is itself a figuring of the kind of damage and pain and labour enacted by McPhee's years of faithful service. So McPhee recounts to the narrator how he becomes caught up in a conflict between rival shipping companies as they trade goods between Liverpool and South American ports. But crucially, these owners, the owners of these companies, are not equivalent. One owner, his wily fellow Scot, McRimmon, is clearly distinguished from the other firm, McPhee's original employers, the other firm that fires McPhee for his honest account of his engine's capabilities, and crucially that invests in paint but not in engines. You'll observe, again, I will make faint gestures towards Scottishness, but no great commitment to it, I'm afraid. You'll observe there's been a new election on the board. I heard the shares were selling hither and yon, and the major part of the board was new to me. So McPhee spent years and years in kind of faithful service to his ship, the engines of this company's ships. But now, due to the machinations of corporate capitalism, there's a new board, and a new board that has, in essence, broken the trust and the faith between their ships and the men who tend them. The old board would ne'er have done it. They trusted me, but the new board was all for reorganization. Young Steiner's son, the Jew, was at the bottom of it, and they did not think it worth their while to send me word. So it's clear then from the stories lurking and maybe not so lurking anti-Semitism, what this other company, the McPhee's first employers, represent. What it represents, it seems clear, is a globalized, cosmopolitan, racially othered capitalism, a capitalism not rooted in Anglo-American racialized imperial identity, and that this form of capitalism discounts the labor of both its engineers and its engines, fails to reciprocate their investment, and is ultimately punished by financial disaster. And Brian Chayet, when discussing Kipling and Jewishness, and Chayet positions Kipling's Jews as either, he argues in the narrative, in the stories, loyal imperialists confirming to their racial bias, or, quoting Chayet here, dangerous subversives who represented an alternative universalism to that of the empire. And Chayet continues observing that in Bread Upon the Waters, he argues, the story crudely reflects upon the dire consequences of a destructive Jewish modernity released from its sacred imperial obligations. So the workings of white colonial labour, therefore, tied to the subordinate identity categories of the British Empire. Note the story's insistent emphasis on on Scottishness and Scots labour, are implicitly set in opposition to and as a protest against the racialized, the unracialized, de-imperialized ephemerality of this globalized capitalism. Um, at the site of this conflict, the way in which this conflict and these different understandings of these companies and their relationship with their ships, the site of it is specifically acceleration, specifically the distorted accelerations represented by the new board's new schedule. The first I knew, and I was chief engineer, was the notice of the line's winter sailings and the Breslau timed for 16 days between port and port. 16 days, man. She's a good boat, but 18 is her summertime, mark you. 16 was sheer flying, kiting nonsense. And so I told young Bannister. So in this moment, then, the new board has issued a schedule which bears no relationship to the material realities of its actual ships and completely dismisses the expert knowledge of the men who tend those ships. And it's important then, I said about the contrast between these owners. So this then strikes in essence upon the core principles through which McPhee enacts his imperial labor. There's just one thing that each of us in his trade or profession will not do for any consideration whatever. If I run to time, I run to time, barring all the risks of the high seas. Less than that, under God, I have not done. More than that, by God, I will not do. There's no trick of the trade I'm not acquainted with. Nursing weak engines is fair craftsmanship, but what the board ask is cheating with the risk o' manslaughter additional. You'll note I know my business. And of course, it turns out that McPhee does indeed, fortunately, unfortunately for the firm, but unfortunately for him and McRimmon, does indeed know his business. His fellow owner, his fellow Scotsman, McRimmon, the owner of the other company, who employs him after McPhee's been fired by the first company with the new board, is represented as Scottish as the Scots tend to be in British literature, is a highly miserly. He'll lament the idea of any addition to, say, paint. He'll resist any kind of surface decorative elements. But it's very clear that McRimmon, for all his miserliness, will absolutely not withhold money on what the ships need. He will buy good engines. He will maintain the physical and material integrity of the ships. He will listen to his ship's engineers. And that becomes then crucial, whereas the other firm, the new firm, so to speak, or the newly reconstituted firm immersed in global capitalism, slaps paint and on serious functional and structural breaches and sends its ships off to try and enact timetables are simply physically impossible. So the ship in question, the Breslau, breaks down, leaving McRimmon and McPhee financially and spiritually triumphant, since the former planned for the opportunity of a lucrative salvage of the ship that turns out to be disastrous for the other firm. I just want to make sure to think it's the slide. Yes, I'm just checking. And it was having used the word upon the waters to set up those sort of those different forms of speed, the artificial speeds of globalized capitalism versus the sort of inescapable rigorous materiality of imperial labor, I wanted to call our attention to what's in a way as the fundamental optimism, it seems to me, of this story. It's an optimism I think we all slightly hope for, a belief that the predatory depredations of profit-centered capitalism can be countered by the sheer materiality of the steamship and the labors of mechanical care that it requires. That is, the story seeks, in effect, to repudiate global capitalism's logic of perpetual growth, unhindered by considerations of the hidden or dismissed costs of producing such acceleration, and unhindered by any meaningful ethics of care. And it is, in a sense, a type of fantasy, isn't it? The belief, the hope that the centre will fall apart, that a failure to care, to invest, a concentration on profit that's decoupled from the work and the workers will automatically produce a moment of wreck, that there'll be a clear moment where the material body and the human body can take no more and break down in ways that ultimately enact a triumph of the right form of labour and the right form of expertise. But of course, we must wonder then what sort of strains might the loyal labours of such as McPhee enact, and what might be the price to be paid for the transformed speeds of glorious imperial futures. So I'm now going to turn to Kipling's engaging fable, so the ship that found herself, or a fable, or I suppose a quasi-fable, unlike the relatively straightforward narrative realism of Bread Upon the Waters. The Ship That Found Herself, then, is a story in which the anthropomorphized, the ship that is talked about like a person. The Dimbula is a cargo steamer sailing from Liverpool to New York. And over the course of a tumultuous transatlantic journey, the ship forms itself from fractured parts into a functioning whole. And we already see, again, another ship owned by a Scots firm, already in launch, built in the north, brought to Liverpool, where she was to take cargo for, sorry, brought to Liverpool, built in the north, brought to Liverpool to take cargo for New York. And here again, at the beginning of The Ship That Found Herself, we can see an echo of the sort of oppositions set up, as I said, in Bread Upon the Waters. And there's a clear, again, sense of a sort of unity that's formed from the right type of speed. Anyone can make a floating hotel that will pay expenses if he puts enough money into the saloon and charges for whatever. But in these days of competition and low freights, every square inch of a cargo boat must be built for cheapness, great hold capacity, and a certain steady speed. So here again, we have an implicit opposition between the sort of commercial, capitalist, globalized interests of anyone can make a floating hotel and the work of imperial trade, imperial cargo carrying, that doesn't require flashy speeds, but a certain steady speed, one that can be built and maintained. So we have then a ship that's all here, but the parts of it have not learned to work together yet. They've had no chance because, as the captain observes, there's more than engines to a ship. Isolated investments, therefore, are not enough. Every inch of her, you'll understand, has to be livened up and made to work with its neighbour. So the story then, the story proceeds and embarks upon its transatlantic journey. And as the story unfolds and as the journey unfolds, engines, wood deck beams, iron pillars, funnel stays, and yes, the garboard strake all have their voice in which they lament the terrible strains put on them by the transatlantic voyage. And intriguing in the story, the steam is both an integral part of the ship's labours and the ship's movement, but also separate from it. So it was the story, the voices in the ship are the voices of the Dimbula, and the steam sort of acts as a kind of guider of the ship's parts to unity. It's both part and yet not part of the ship. So Kipling then creates a world, a series of voices, and in doing so, of course, has his own darkly playful poke at his own anthropomorphism. Their conversation, of course, he assures us, is not as half as wise as our human talk, because they are all, though they do not know it, bound down one to the other in a black darkness, where they cannot tell what is happening near them, nor what will overtake them next. Of course, buried in that passage, it seems to me, is Kipling enjoying his own little dark joke. Is this so different from human talk or from the human condition? But humans aren't really in this story. I mean, there's the crew, and the crew's sort of there at the beginning and serves at the end as their commentary, as a kind of commentary upon the success of the ship's journey. But the real sort of essence of the story lies in the bringing in the individual pieces of the Dimbula and the work that's been asked of each of them, and the type of commonality of imperial labour. So here again, we have, of course, rivets coming as another symbol of the potential disintegration, of the potential collapse of a ship put to excessive labours that fails to find unity in the in necessary commonality of imperial and transatlantic labour. No rivet forge can stand this strain, the rivets chattered indignantly. No one rivet was ever meant to. Share it among you, the steam answered. And the steam then talks each part of the ship through its importance in the place, assures each part, that they and they alone are the absolutely crucial part of the ship. So at the same time, they are individually the most important part of the ship. And also, every one of them must pull together, literally and figuratively, in order to assure ensure a triumphant unity and in order to ensure the steady speed that'll bring them safe to shore. So he, the steam, orated and chattered until the beams and frames and floors and stringers and things had learnt how to lock down and lock up on one another and endure this new type of strain. And even as the story proceeds, the parts of the ship start discovering their own identity and the way in which that identity interlocks with the whole. The first time in the history of shipbuilding that the inward pull of the deck beams and the outer thrust of the frames locks us, as it were, more closely in our places. And of course, even as the pieces are finding this out, we, the readers, are implicitly being educated by Kipling in the work that goes into the speed achieved by a transatlantic cargo ship. And so we have the triumphant arrival into New York. And here we have another ship that looks like a wreck. Now, a man judging superficially would say we were a wreck. But crucially, the Dimbula has not been wrecked. The Dimbula might look a little battered and disheveled, but has come through its difficult voyage triumphantly. And then in the moment, its voices become dissolved into one, the soul of the ship. When a ship finds herself, all the talking of the separate pieces ceases and melts into one voice, which is, again, the soul of the ship. So the ship that found itself then, Walt's playfulness, playful fabulistic approach, is telling in a way another sort of essentially hopeful story, a story in a sense that where all the pieces come together into the right type of labor that achieve a moment of transatlantic fusion, that the unity of the ship is its own form of success story. But the third and final story I want to talk about today, it's also a type of success story, but it's a story that in many ways is much darker than the other two. The optimism, as I suggest, that lies at the heart of each of these, has turned into a sort of bleaker meditation on exactly what type of sacrificial imperial labor might entail. This ultimately is a story that does end with multiple, with, as we'll see, not just one wreck, but multiple wrecks. So we turn now then to the devil and the deep sea. And here again, we move in a way away from the more fabulistic approach of the ship that found herself, back towards the more satirical realist fiction of Bread Upon the Waters. And the setup of the story is a slightly complicated one, but the British crew of a disreputable steamer in the East Indies, now Indonesia, deeply enmeshed in the dodgier interconnections of marine resources and trade, finds itself subjected to superior gunboat and colonial rule of another power. So there's nothing as respectable relatively as long established shipping and trading firms here. The uh, the ship is the ship, which has undergone under a number of multiple different names, though now featuring the story as the Haliotis, and its crew are clearly part of Kipling's frequent dodgier aspects of empire, the rogues and rascals who in essence keep much of the structures of the, as we know from Kipling's work, British Army and British commerce, in fact, going. In this moment, then, the crew, however, find themselves subjected to the superior gunboats and colonial rule of another power. So even despite their, perhaps because, as we see, of their disreputableness, the crew are still very closely identified with being a British crew. And there's a lot of interesting discussion. I'd refer you here to Alistair Wilson's own notes on the Kipling Society website and Stephen Miller's discussion of the story, Mullen Miller. That discusses the sort of, if you like, national and racial ambiguity of the crew. The foreign power is possibly based on the Dutch around the Indonesian islands and the conflicts they experienced with the crew of Australians. In the story, however, the crew is referred to as the Englishmen, though, of course, as you know, that's a term that often takes on a surprising capaciousness. I'll be teaching The Man Who Would Be King later this semester, a story which does remarkably loose things with the concept of what it means to be English, but I digress. So the crew in the story are referred to as the Englishmen, and crucially, despite their sort of disreputableness, they orient their actions around a context of reception at the heart of empire. Think you they'll ever know in England, as the ship's engineer asks the captain as they're unloaded. as prisoners. So the particular affront, though, of this seemingly superior power, the affront of this superior power that has successfully taken over and wrecked their gunboat, is an affront, crucially, of speed. The Haliotus is convinced. I keep wanting to say Haliotosis. I think that's my problem. Probably Kipling indeed rather enjoying that riff, but Haliotus. Part of the thing is Haliotus thinks, in other words, that it is the superior ship. It thinks it can outrun anything on these waters. But there is a new expensive steam patrol with a brought up in third and a 14-knot boat with a clean bottom to help the work, and so finds itself, to its great anger, taken over by the accelerated speed of this foreign power. So unlike the gradual disintegration produced by commercial interests and bred upon the waters, where again the ships of the first firm gradually disintegrate under refusal to tend to them and pressure and commercial pressures, unlike that, this ship suffers a direct hit on its engine room. Fortunately, however, it is possessed of yet another Scots engineer, Mr. Wardrop, and a crew grimly determined to enact revenge. So even as, again, this is another ship that really does seem to be a wreck. The Haliotis is a wreck. It has been suffered a direct hit. It should be basically out for the count. But here again, we have a ship that looks like a wreck, but may not be quite so much of a wreck as it seems. They've twisted the very guts out of her, bringing her up with that jerk, Mr. Wardrobe was saying. But I'm saying that with time and patience, there's just the chance of making steam yet. We could do it. So the story proceeds into another story about another steam-centered narrative of extraordinary speed. But there's a new type of extraordinary speed being envisaged here, not the improbable, unachievable, extraordinary speeds of the global capitalism manifested and bred upon the waters. Nor the sort of, if you like, steady speed of the Dimbula's transatlantic voyage. Instead, there's a type of speed that's created precisely out of its seeming impossibility through a series of sacrificial labors. And there's an extraordinary process in the story where, again, in this story of all the three I've looked at, the boundaries between men and ships, between the bodies of the workers and the work that's done, and the engines and the ships being acted upon, that those boundaries seem to be increasingly elided over the course of the story, not again in a fabulistic or metaphorical way even, but almost a literal offering up of their bodies in order to try and achieve this new form of speed. So these were the days when men swooned over the ratchet drill and the hand forge, and where they fell, they had leave to lie unless their bodies were in the way of their fellows' feet. So the forges were lit again, and men burnt their bodies, but hardly felt the pain. So again, the idea of these bodies being offered up. The finished connection was not beautiful, but it seemed strong enough, at least as strong as the rest of the machinery, and with that job, their labours came to an end. And so,
Hi, love. I'm just leaving Rachel's now.
I think someone might need a quick meeting
I'm a
there.
bit later than usual because Richard
So
delayed
the
well.
type of
I had
speed
to wait for
that
Rachel to
the
come back
crew
from
achieve
football.
at this moment, this
Okay.
extraordinary rebuilding of the engines of the ship, is something that achieves a type of battered triumph. That the goal is no longer the 11 knots that the Haliotosis used to be able to do, or the 14 knots of the triumphant other foreign power gunboat. Instead, all it achieves is a slow 2 knots an hour. She crawled up to a triumphant 4. Even the crew's seizure of a local boat's sails even achieves its own kind of grotesque unity of steam and sail. And there's a fascinating image there Kipling evokes of a respectable charwoman in the tights of a ballet dancer rolling drunk along the streets, and you will come to some faint notion of the appearance of that 1,900-ton, well-decked, once schooner-rigged cargo boat as she staggered under her new help, with steam and sail that marvellous voyage continued. Because the slow speed that the crew so painfully build is in a way in opposition to acceleration. This slow speed is a triumph, but it's an intentionally destructive one. The real result is not just the escape, their real goal. Its result is actively seeking to get away, yes, but also to wreck their own ship, where it can do the most damage to their enemy's vessel. So this speed that's created by the sacrificial offering up of the bodies, is one that reasserts the rightful racial and cultural order of empire, the success and triumph of the Englishman, but at considerable cost. So we see in the ending the power of the wreck, the power of wrecking, the power of materiality, which is also again a rebuke to improper speed. Months afterwards, there were a few lines in an English newspaper to the effect that some gunboats of some foreign power had broken her back, again look at the imagery there, at the mouth of some faraway harbour by running at full speed into a sunken wreck. Um, so in the final few minutes of this talk, I want to, I suppose, to open out to talk, and touch on some of the ways in which I'm interested in sort of taking these ideas, and to open some of the ways in which I'll be interested to hear your own thoughts on what it is that Kipling is doing with steamships and labour and forms of speed. But the thing I particularly like, perhaps to close, to almost close on, a few minutes, I'm afraid, is to think about the work that Kipling is enacting here, the work of the steamship, the work of the ship's engineers, is also, of course, an extended meditation, as is Kipling's wont, on the work and labour of writing, and perhaps most particularly on the work and labour of reading. There's a certain irony. I've only just today been giving out a midterm assignment, complete with lots of anxious discussion and urgings of the students to stay away from the hideous speedy productions of ChatGPT and give themselves over, if you like, to the work of careful, attentive reading and writing, and assuring them of the value and importance of this. All three of these stories, it seems to me, represent certain challenges to the reader. Bread Upon the Waters requires an engagement, of course, with McPhee's voice and with the complicated intersections of the two shipping firms and salvage laws. But it's not, I think, a particularly difficult story, at least not for people familiar with 19th century stories, and particularly Kipling's frequent use of dialect and voices. The Ship That Found Herself, by definition, is a rather different matter. It requires, in a way, an incredibly sort of detail. It takes you through the pieces and parts of the ship at an incredibly detailed technical level. But of course, in a way, you don't need to know what these pieces are. You don't need to know the workings of a ship, because you're drawn into the narrative of unity and connection and individual labour coming together in a whole. So the Ship That Found Herself may be occasionally bewildering, but it doesn't matter in a sense. You don't know what the individual parts are because you're being brought in by the act of reading. And the reason I think I wanted to end on The Devil and the Deep Sea is precisely because I find it such a strange story. It's not a story I ever liked very much. I liked it a lot more once I started working on it. As I used to just treat it as an aside, oh, by the way, there's a ship there. The Devil in the Deep Sea is a really strange story. As you'll see from indeed Wilson's own notes, the technical details, what it is that the ship's engineer is trying to do, is almost, first of all, whether it's probable at all in the real world is apparently a matter for much intensive technological and engineering debate. But also it's completely bewildering. It's in a way an alienating story, I find anyway, a story that makes the reader, in a sense, have to slow down, have to join almost even as we read in the bewildering work of trying to reassemble that engine and produce and eke out, if we can, the final parts of that slower speed. So I want, in the end, close, I suppose, on a sort of meditation on what the steamship, not everything has to be about modernity. I think there's a specificity to the steamship and its 19th century figurings that I think it's important we connect with. But there's no doubt that if steam was the big time and space developer of the 19th century and flight of the 20th century, so far in the 21st century, the great speeding up has not, in fact, so much been about bodies as it has about technology and knowledge. And it is the speed of knowledge and the speed of production that's where the unnatural speeds that seem to be taking, the accelerations, if you like, of 21st century modernity. And it seems to me that we may see in these stories meditations on the types of work asked for, unsettling echoes in 21st century tech culture's emphasis on a vision of epistemological acceleration, untethered by concerns about the costs of production or the damages to the people who use and who become its product. As recent events suggest, Kipling was right to see in the workings of globalized capitalism a threat to his vision of an Anglo-American unity. What he could not or would not see, perhaps, was how the racialized hierarchies of his trans-imperial world order, and the exploitative ecologies of globalized capitalism could not necessarily be so easily separated, or rather, in many ways, integrally forced. These forces' malignant growths were and are fueled by a destructive logic of untrammeled acceleration and escalating by global power imbalances. In this, then, I still think there's something valuable to think about in the Kipling's meditation on the slow work, on the nature of slow day work, but also his meditation on the costs and potential damages of the type of sacrificial labor required to produce a fundamental slowing down. And I think I'll put various other things I'd love to discuss, but I'd also excited to hear your thoughts, so I think I will break it off there. Thank you very much, everyone.